Hello and welcome to our series here at the Minneapolis Foundation on the state of Minnesota nonprofits. At the beginning of this year, we had a conversation with Nonoko Sato, who is the head of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, about the challenges facing the nonprofit sector. You can find that chat on the YouTube page for the Minneapolis Foundation. And since then, we've had conversations each month with leaders of different nonprofits in hopes of helping our fund holders gain a better understanding of how rapid changes are affecting organizations, and also to equip those fund holders to make their giving more impactful in this moment. I'm Tom Weber, and I'm so pleased to be taking a moment today to bring Nonoko Sato back for an update to that conversation we had all those months ago. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me again.
We first spoke as a new administration was taking office, but as you noted back then, there was already a lot happening in nonprofit world even before the new administration took office. How has life changed in these past 8 or so months?
I mean, it really hasn't necessarily changed in that nonprofits are continuing to struggle and seeing a lot of increase in demands for services. There's a lot of uncertainty, but also layered on top of that, it's this fear, right? Like that they're doing something wrong, or are they doing something wrong? Is this something that's actually illegal? So there's a lot of questions that I think nonprofits are really grappling with. But the bottom line is that nonprofits continue to struggle in terms of raising their funding, but also meeting the needs of the rising need of services that their communities are demanding from them.
One of the big things that has happened since our last conversation was this big bill that Congress passed in July. A lot of tax breaks, a lot of tax policy, and a lot of implications for nonprofits. What are you learning? What have you learned about how that big bill will affect nonprofit world?
Yeah, I mean, I think folks need to remember that nonprofits are partners to government agencies, right? That we have the expertise, the trust of the communities to be able to provide services that the government has been tasked to do. And so there's that, I think that there's something missing there, because right now with the big bill, one of the biggest implication are the cuts to social safety net programs, such as SNAP programs, Medicare, Medicaid programs, that will certainly impact individuals and families who are going to be most vulnerable in terms of not being able to have food on their table and healthcare. But the first place that they will turn to are their local nonprofit organizations. And at the same time, these nonprofits who are struggling already to meet the demands that are rising, they're also facing an issue around uncertainty of federal funding, or even if they're getting funding at all. There was an organization that we were speaking to who were already pledged a 2-year grant from the federal government to provide services. And that second year is supposed to be 2025. And I don't know what they're doing right now, but they were unsure at the beginning of the year whether or not they can actually even provide the services, mainly because with the reimbursement model, they're like the government, you have to spend the money first and then the government reimburses you. So if you spend the money, there's no certainty that they're going to get the money back that they've already spent. So like it's like a no-win situation for many nonprofit organizations. And then on top of that, there's also a tax around this like DEI, right? There's this like topic of like illegal DEI, but there's no clear definition around what is illegal about DEI. We can certainly surmise like what this administration might be going after, especially, based off of their attacks on immigrants and trans rights and trans people's rights, for example. But there's no clear definition, and there's already a law that exists to prevent any employer from, discriminating off of like hiring and firing people based off of a protected class. So there's just a lot of uncertainty around like, well, is this something that we can keep on our website? What kind of language can we actually use? And I also think it's really important to note that there are also organizations that provide support for these vulnerable organizations that have no choice. They can't scrub the language from their website because that's essentially their mission. If they're providing services for trans youth, that's their organization. So what are they supposed to do? Just delete certain words that doesn't exist anymore. So I think that there are a lot of like legality questions, like risk analysis, things that nonprofits really are just really grappling with in terms of what is actually allowed and what is not.
There's actually also a lot of things from that big bill that don't take effect yet. They
Yes.
actually haven't taken
Right.
effect. So we think about Medicaid,
Yeah.
right? A massively important healthcare
Right.
program that hasn't, those cuts haven't happened yet. And so it's interesting to hear you talk a moment ago about when the cuts do happen, a lot of times when people lose their services, they run to a nonprofit.
Right.
So that stampede in some ways hasn't even happened in some places.
Right. You're right. Yeah. But the anticipation already, organizations are already planning for that. And when you're looking at, greater Minnesota, for example, when organizations, there's might be one organizations that serve a particular community, if they're very heavily reliant, and many organizations are, on federal funding, and they already know that their funding is going to get cut due to whatever reasons that might be given, how do you plan for a future, even if it is, 3 to 5 years down the road? How do you plan for that, knowing that your community is going to need you, but you don't even have the funds to even put together the foundation in place to make sure that you can meet that need in the long run? Yeah.
Yeah. Earlier, before this big bill passed, there was something in the first couple months of the new administration with a lot of cuts to federal government agencies. Doge was the name of it,
Yeah.
and all of that. And there was a lot of attention given to federal employees who worked for this department or that department who lost their job. Did you see and hear of that, all of that chaos, that unpredictability trickling down into the nonprofit sector, even though technically those layoffs wouldn't have technically been of a nonprofit employee, for example?
Right. One example I could give is that we recently hired for our director of public policy here at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and the number of candidates who have vast experience in federal government applied for the role. So and they didn't necessarily have statewide experience. Maybe they had family who lives in Minnesota, who knows? But the thing is, I need somebody who has more Minnesota experience, but there were a lot of very qualified candidates who were clearly looking for a job outside of the federal government. But beyond that, when you're looking at specific agencies, let's say, for example, the Internal Revenue Service, it's a really critical agency for nonprofit organizations. And if there is, if there's already a lack of individuals who are working there, nonprofits aren't able to get a hold of anybody to ask a question of why is my tax exempt status suddenly revoked? Well, we don't know, and they can't get a hold of anybody to resolve it at all. And so I do think that will definitely impact nonprofit organizations. And same thing with agencies that provide more direct service or housing or human service agencies with less people doing oversight or providing support for nonprofit organization. It makes it more difficult for nonprofits to access the funding that they actually qualify for. And so to that end, I think nonprofits are also trying to figure out whether it's even worth their time and effort to try to apply for federal funding that they actually could really use, because they don't even know if they're going to get it, and or if they're even going to get support to be able to access those resources that they know that they actually qualify for.
Going back to the big bill for a moment, there was one thing, I believe the National Council of Nonprofits talked about this. There was in that bill, there's a permanent universal charitable deduction of $1,000 for individuals and $2,000 for joint filers. And so my understanding is that in the past, if you have given to charities, you had to itemize it, and if you met a certain limit, then it counted, or et cetera, et cetera. And it sounds like that helps take some of that burden away. You can just have this tax benefit now on federal taxes. Is there any indication as to whether this will actually increase giving to charities?
We certainly hope so. We've certainly supported this particular issue before in the past. And I also think a small win doesn't negate a lot of the other negative aspects of this particular bill, right? And so even if you are an individual and you are able to itemize your tax, your donations on your tax forms, which is great, you still can't get that tax deduction for the first, I believe, 0.5% of your donation anyway. Looking at the corporate sector, same thing. The corporate sector, the first 1% of your donation that you're giving as a corporation to a nonprofit sector is also not going to be counted towards your charitable giving. So in a way, yes, it incentivizes, but to what degree? And there's still already a disincentivization
Yeah.
of giving, despite the fact that, yes, like we support the bill. It's a very small win for us, but in the whole, it's really not going to cover the amount of federal dollars that should be going into the nonprofit sector. It's just we just can't cover it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Have your conversations with nonprofit executive directors, leaders, staff, have those conversations changed in the last 8 months, or are you still largely talking about what you were talking about even last December?
Yeah, I think they have a lot of questions about legality of things, or is it, can we sue if we don't get this particular funding? Like, what are the options that we have available? So to that end, we are very lucky in Minnesota that we have a lot of funders and folks who really care about the nonprofit sector. And so with a partnership with Legal Corps, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, we recently launched a nonprofit legal service initiative to provide legal support for nonprofits, many of them who can't afford legal support. And it could just be as basic as, like, as I mentioned before, I wrote something around DEI on my website. Is this actually illegal? And to be able to have somebody to assure them to say, no, you're fine, especially because you don't get any federal funding, you're going to be fine. That alone is worth whatever dollars
Yeah.
that they were willing to spend. But many nonprofits don't necessarily have the resources to be able to do that. So I do think that conversations are changing. I also think, nonprofits are also starting to get a little mistrust, not even starting. There's increase in the mistrust of nonprofits in general. And it started certainly from Feeding Our Future scandal, where a few individuals pretending to be nonprofits stole a whole bunch of funding intended for children, right? And that's awful. Like, we are all angry about it. But to vilify an entire sector that's actually here to support communities because of that, I think is really harming the sector as a whole. I think nonprofits are now dealing with these kind of questions from their donors, from organizations that they might be partnering with, and even the community members themselves who are just like, well, how do I know that you're not stealing my money? Well, because, like, we've been around for 50 years and look at all the great things that we've done, but there's just no sense of, like, well, what happens if that organization ceases to exist in that community? Like, well, who's going to take, who's going to fill that hole that's going to be left behind?
And no one knows until
And
it
no one
happens.
knows. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. When, I'm sure in a position like yours, you are asked by people, what is your advice on how I should give, how I should show up to support nonprofits? Has that advice changed in the last few months that you give?
It has for me. I am going to be a continued broken record around the importance of general operating funds, making sure that it's unrestricted, especially for an organization that you've, as a donor, have been working with for many years. Like, why aren't you trusting them at this moment in time to be able to spend your money wisely? And I also think, one of the things that we do is it's called a current conditions report. We do a survey with all of our nonprofits every year. We've been doing it since the start of the pandemic. One of the bright spots is that we're seeing an increase in the number of organizations who are doing advocacy work. In the past, I was one myself, like when I was an executive director of a small nonprofit organizations, somebody told me once that you're not supposed to do any advocacy, and that was it. And then I'm also like, well, I have all these other things I need to do. Like, when am I going to have time to go to the Capitol and advocate for issues that I'm an expert on?
And you're talking about advocacy that can be at City Hall or the Capitol, not just for funding, but for policies that can help make life better or change life in certain ways.
That's right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times funding sources restrict nonprofits from being able to use it for advocacy, like public policy advocacy purposes. And so I do think that that is one thing that I am changing my message on a little bit, is that to please help support advocacy for nonprofit organizations, to be able to give them the tools, which we can also provide, and the funding to be able to go to the Capitol and advocate for the issues that they are experts on. And I also think that donors, if they want to be partners to the nonprofit sector, they themselves are citizens and or community members themselves, and we would love to be able to see them share the stories, the good stories and impact of nonprofits that they're supporting, why it's important to them, what is it that they what is it that they see in terms of the impact of that particular nonprofit, and continue to share that story. Because I think I think we're being a little too reactive in terms of like, no, 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 we're not fraudulent versus like, let's be proactive and actually talk about the strength of the nonprofit sector and what happens if we no longer exist for all of us.
That's a lot. That's a lot
Yeah.
that's been happening. What gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think the increase in advocacy from nonprofits really does give me hope. I think, generosity, especially in Minnesota, we've seen so many people and our elected officials who really deeply care about thriving communities and see sort of the thread of where the nonprofit stands in terms of how a community can really thrive, right? I think I hold on to that. I think, people who work in our sector, who dedicate so much time and energy and mental resources to continue to provide services that their community really needs, and meeting those people and hearing their stories really gives me energy anyway to continue to like share their stories as well and talking about their impact. So yeah, I mean, we have to operate from a place of hope. I think nonprofits in general, we are just kind of driven by hope because there's so many things we notice around the world that's harming our communities, that makes us sad, that's really frightening in many ways. But we continue to do this day after day because we know the importance of thriving communities, and this is the world that we want to be able to live in. So yeah, that gives me hope.
Well, thank you very much,
Yeah, thanks
as
for having me.
always, for your insights. We hope that you have found this useful. The organization, the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, produces every year a report called The State of Nonprofits. That's actually where we got the title for this video series. And another one is coming soon.
Yeah.
So stay tuned for that. I also would invite you to register for our Minnesota meeting that is being held by the Minneapolis Foundation on October 8th. This year's topic is called Next in News. It's about local journalism and the local news ecosystem across Minnesota. So we will have a link in the description for this show where you can learn more and register for that. We sure hope to see you and sign up. And we also invite our fund holders to connect with your philanthropic advisor if you have further question about the work that Nonoko is doing, about her organization, or about any of these organizations across the state and how you can have a bigger impact with your giving. Thanks so much for joining us.